I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is the 314. Every episode, we sit down with St. Louisans who know what makes this place tick. Together, we explore why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. This episode of the 314 podcast is sponsored by Stages St. Louis. Earlier this month, Missouri Democrats were livid after Republicans used a rare procedural move to shut down debate with a few days of the session remaining. Democratic lawmakers are now vowing to no longer cooperate with their GOP counterparts, and that could have big consequences for St. Louis. Steve Butz has represented St. Louis and Jefferson City since 2018. He walked me through the dramatic end to this year's legislative session and what it means for everything from stadium funding in Kansas City to tornado relief in St. Louis. He also shared his thoughts on Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe. Now, one thing to note, after we recorded our conversation, the governor announced a special session that will combine tornado relief for St. Louis with stadium funding for Kansas City. And that makes Representative Butz's analysis even more timely. Representative Steve Butz, welcome.
Good morning to you.
So the legislative session had some highs, it had some lows, and then it ended in a way that pretty much everyone seems to agree was just ugly. Give us the short version. What happened that left such a sour taste in so many mouths?
Yeah, so I'm going to agree with your first part. It started off pretty good, unlike the past couple of years where we were front page news just day after day with dysfunction at every level. This year, things were moving along much better. And positive things were getting accomplished. Bills that were meaningful were moving through. And that is the way the entire year happened right up until Wednesday evening. Now, there was rumors, more than rumors. We knew that there was going to be a titanic shift in attitudes pretty quickly. But on that Wednesday evening in the Senate chamber, and the real meltdown happened on the Senate side, and I'm on the House side of things. But a whole group of us, there's a large group in the Senate chamber, and Senate leadership, and by that I mean Republicans exclusively, no Democrats here, and not even all the Republicans. I mean most of them, but there were a couple, three that did not join in this parliamentary move is the best way I can describe it. The Senate by design is meant to be a slower moving, more deliberative body, a lot more communication. On the House side, we have a very short time limit. Basically, you get to say your piece and then, boom.
Things happen or they don't.
That's right. Debate's over and we're going to take a vote. In the Senate, it's days and weeks goes into crafting a position. And so they use this parliamentary move that people commonly just call the PQ, the move to a previous question. It just means we're shutting off debate and there's going to be a vote. It does happen. Yeah. It has happened historically. It might be an exaggeration to say it's a nuclear option, but this time it was a nuclear option because they did it twice in 15 minutes. And that part's just unheard of. And on both issues, and it really came because of serious debate on Amendment 3 and Proposition A, two things that we, the people, voted for. And again, the majority party Republicans want to overturn the will of the people. They decided to use that twice to force this through, and that's where we are today. So then the immediate reaction from a good friend of mine, Senator Doug Beck from Afton, he's the leader of the Democrats on the Senate side, and he gave an empowered statement speech saying, we didn't choose this. You all chose it. You've decided to tear down the Senate, and it is going to have repercussions well into both now and well into the future. So things shut down, and it was ugly, and it was over.
That was the end of the Senate session. And then in the House, all you could do was kind of put things through that were almost done.
Yeah, correct. Things that had already, cleared the Senate, we can take them up, not make any changes to them. But one important one on that very last day for us, that Thursday, constitutionally, we can stay, and generally we do stay working till very close to 6 p.m. on that Friday. But the Senate was already adjourned, so we adjourned at about 3:30 on Thursday, just a week ago or so. But that being said, the one thing we got passed right at the last minute was this entertainment district for downtown St. Louis. So two big things for St. Louis. That was one. sort of carving out, I don't want to call it a special business district, but, a special taxing district that's along Washington Avenue and encompasses actually a whole large swath of the downtown St. Louis area. That was important. And unfortunately, Senator Steve Roberts from the 5th, who had this great bill that was going to pass for these historic tax credits, primarily for the AT&T building, and that sadly died. And
that died because of this sort of nuclear option.
It did.
Because that ended the session, he was not able to get something that had the votes to a vote.
Correct. It had the votes. The negotiations were all done. It just had to, wait its line and turn, and there was plenty of time to do so. Again, just as a bit of a spectator watching on the Senate, I'm like, even if the Republican majority was going to ram this down the Missouri voters' throats and all the Democrats and even a couple of their Republican colleagues, I think they would have waited until they passed every other bill that they'd all been working on.
Got through the rest of this legislation first. They didn't do that.
They did not do that.
So I want to talk about these bigger picture repercussions here in a moment. But first, I want to just clarify for people the two things that they were so eager to push through, that they kind of did this nuclear option and shut down everything else. And these were basically trying to repeal or bring back to the voters these things that voters had already approved. One was the overturning of the state abortion ban and sort of guaranteeing reproductive rights in the state constitution.
Correct.
That now goes back to the voters.
It does.
Right after we already voted on.
I know, because it's like they say, we're going to give you a chance. You got it wrong, and we're going to give you a chance. I think when people read the amendment that the Democrats had agreed to sit down, as we say, and allow the regular process to carry forward, basically, and this is going to be a well-publicized amendment that the Democrats were willing to put forth, and that is, okay, we don't like it. It stinks. I don't think Missourians like it, and it stinks. But at least be honest with the voters. And when you read the wording of what, now this might change in the courts, it might, it's going to be challenged.
There will be a legal challenge.
There will be a legal
100%.
challenge. But when you read, and I'm going to really publicize these two facts, here is what they're proposing we're going to vote on, quote unquote, because we got it wrong the first time. And then the second one is, here's what the Democrats were willing to put forward. And it basically is clear language saying you're repealing what you just voted for.
Yeah.
And there are these exceptions.
Yeah.
And we're taking out the kids' transgender care that has nothing to do with anything as part of the bill. I just think no matter where you stand on the issue, if you believe that elections have consequences and they're meaningful, I think you're going to look at these two things and say, one party is just not only disingenuous, it's just dishonest in the wording of what you're proposing. Put your proposals out in the public sphere.
Yeah.
Debate them, advertise them, and then let's have a vote, which is what we did do.
We did do that.
We did do it.
Now we're going to do it again, and we're doing it with language that Democrats have said very forcefully, this is going to be misleading. People won't even fully understand what they're voting on. I understand it doesn't even mention abortion.
It will mention abortions. It has exceptions for abortion. It sounds like you're voting for an abortion bill with certain exceptions, including rape and incest and serious fetal abnormalities and health concerns. That's the part that's so disingenuous.
But instead, what you're going to be doing is banning most abortions all over again.
Correct. And you're definitely going to be overturning everything that Amendment 3 was addressing.
Oh, okay. So this is one of the things that the Senate then pushed through, nuclear option. They're going to try to now move this forward, get this on the ballot if the courts allow it. The second thing is basically a repeal of the sick leave law that was also approved by voters.
Right. So, and this one, 58%, I'm sure the listeners and yourself know, a 58% victory on a statewide vote in Missouri. I mean, it is a landslide. It is a landslide. And this bill, Prop A, so it's an increase of minimum wage and then included earned, you got to keep saying earned sick leave. That's Prop A. And because it's a statutory change, of course, the majority party, the Republicans, can simply overturn it. And it is no more.
They have just decimated that with that nuclear option.
Correct. And it's even worse than that. So we had worked hard, and there's many groups, Missouri Jobs for Justice, just many groups, I don't want to list them all, but have said we need to continuously, improve the lives of working people in Missouri. One way to do it is to increase the minimum wage, and we have been doing that. And it has a lot of support. I think the concept of some earned sick leave also has a lot of support. Even this version now with the complete repeal, we've even lost the inflation index factor that was for slow, steady. And I am all for this. Many of the problems we get into are because we don't means test anything and we don't index everything. And if we slowly would have been raising, let's just use minimum wage, over many years, businesses could adjust, people could adjust. But when you go 8, 10, 12, 15 years, and then you have to jump at $3, just making up numbers, it's more difficult to adjust. So there was an inflation index, and now even that is no more.
So they've taken it back past what was there before
Correct.
The voters approved this.
We're set where we are right now. We're going to eventually get to $15 an hour, somewhere in this range, but then no automatic increases. So we're going to have to make that, that's going to have to be fixed. Yeah. There's a lot of support for that. It's one of those unintended consequences of when
maybe they were just moving too fast.
They are moving too fast. And when you have a supermajority and term limits, I said to everybody, I'm sure I voted for term limits, but when you've been there, and I'm in my 4th and final term, I'm in my 7th year, and you think you just get to where you know what you're doing about year 3 or 4. This is true. And I don't want to say you're like a lame duck in year 8, but there's some senioritis creeps in, and your first couple of years, you don't know much at all. And unfortunately, that institutional knowledge, it is no more. It does remain with some of the staff. It certainly, for better or for worse, stays with the lobbying core. They're there year in, year out for decades on end. But when it comes to the actual representatives and senators that have to vote, it doesn't allow for that. And if you're always worried about possibly moving up to the next office or improving your image or
trying to
running
figure out that next move.
Whatever you're going to do, I think, good policy is not that sexy. Blowing stuff up gets a lot of hits. It rallies the base, and it's all about winning in the primary, and the more extreme candidates are winning in primaries. So there's many issues here.
And that's how we end up with what we saw at the end of this session.
Absolutely. So one senator in particular, Adam Schnelting, he just a freshman senator, and it would appear he had, and I do not understand this, I'm going to keep digging into how a guy who's a freshman senator came through the House can basically run the table on the Senate side. I marvel at it. It was, I'm sure, a genius move on his part, but boy, was it a bad, sad day for both the entire legislature and really the citizens of the state.
We're talking today to State Representative Steve Butz, who represents a district of South City, St. Louis. We're going to come back and talk about some of the repercussions because the Republicans hit that nuclear button, so to speak. What could happen going from here? But first, a quick word from our sponsor. One actor plays the detective. The other plays 13 suspects, and they both play the piano. Witness the murderously funny musical Murder for Two, May 30th through June 29th at the Kirkwood Performing Arts Center. Visit stagesstlewis.org or call 314-821-2407 to get your tickets today. And now back to our conversation with State Representative Steve Butz, talking about the dramatic end of the legislative session that just wrapped up this month. Steve represents a big part of South City in the Statehouse. So the Republicans went for this nuclear option, and obviously that meant a lot of things couldn't get through at the end of this year. But people are saying it wasn't just about this session, that the bad blood from this move is going to carry over. Tell me what that is going to look like.
So I'm going to paraphrase the speech and response from Senator Doug Beck. He said, okay, you decided to do this today, but this is going to bear out over the next year and beyond. The way the Senate is set up, there are 10 Democratic senators, 24 Republican senators, so supermajority in both chambers. However, 10 senators, even 2 or 3, who are committed to a cause, as we saw in the previous couple of years, can gum up the works slow down the works, virtually kill any chance of any bill. And of course, for anything to get done, it has to go through both chambers and have support by the governor, right? It could stop it any one of these ways. So I think, and I do not believe it was a hollow promise when Senator Beck said, do not ask, do not expect, nothing is going to move through this chamber next year. This is going to have repercussions. And, there's always, in the heat of any battle, in a really big argument such as this, sure, I think people say things, but I believe these are colleagues that I know, love, and trust. When they say we didn't just try to meet you 50-50, and I think that's what the public needs to know. They went 90-10. They might have gone 95-5. I mean, they did everything they could do, the Democrats, to say, just don't blow up the institution. We're still going to vote no, and we're still going to lose the vote.
Yeah.
But we're going to at least agree to have a vote. Since that wasn't done, I am positive for sure, at least this next year, the ramification is nothing is going to get done. And unless we have, for example, just in a special session, so the Chiefs bill, now, I'm a St. Louis guy and I'm kind of against Chiefs getting more money, but I like to see them win.
Governor Mike Kehoe wants to give a lot of money to keep the Chiefs and the Royals in Missouri. He's going to call a special session. He wants you guys all to come back. What do you think's going to happen here?
So it's his prerogative to do so, and I believe he will do so. He said he is, and if you would be the governor, I think you would too, right? I mean, do you want to be the governor that potentially loses the Chiefs and the Royals to Kansas? I don't believe so. However, this nuclear option may very well have lit the fuse that ignites a backlash that does pave a way. If they move, to me, this is going to be on the Republican senators. I feel that strongly about it. And again, I was a Rams guy, right? So, I'm still mad that the Hunt family, voted to let the Rams move, but that's another story a long time ago. But they had the votes for that. Clearly they did. That was another, just like Steve Roberts' bill on the St. Louis downtown side.
It would have helped the AT&T building.
It was going to help the AT&T building. That also is a victim of this. So, I mean, there's two big issues. A big issue for downtown St. Louis, a big issue for Kansas City. And because they chose to do this on Wednesday at 3:30 or 4:30, as opposed to, 5:30 p.m. on Friday, that is where the blame has to go. And until really Missouri voters, and this is just, I know you understand this enough, this kind of stuff, it's not just happening this time. It's been happening for several years. Yet, no matter, and we're going to keep trying to flip some seats.
Yeah.
But heretofore, it's been tough sledding. And you think that people would wake up and say, my senator, my rep is destructive. He's not helping. They're just being lemmings. They're not representing their districts. There are many examples of that. And until the voters really change that makeup, I don't know that we're going to see a lot of big change. And if the Senate slowly or quickly morphs into a version of the House where you just do this all the time, that there'll be no point.
Because good legislation then can't get through, or because nothing good will happen? I mean, what's the bad consequence of the Senate becoming the House?
Yeah, nothing good will happen. I do think nothing good will happen. And the most extreme positions on the Republican side will be forced down our throats. I mean, you see this on SEPA, on the gun legislation.
That's the Second Amendment.
Quote unquote Preservation Act. That was also part of the negotiation on this. But I mean, if you always say, if 80% of people, and I think this is one of those 80-20 things, using it as an example, should minors under the age of 18 be able to, just carry firearms? Well, I think if you put that to a public vote, that would resoundingly be no. But yet that's where we're at because of these extremist positions. And so any kind of change, anything like that, it is never going to happen because of this nuclear option.
So obviously, the Chiefs leaving for Kansas, that's a huge issue. And I know people in Kansas City care deeply about that. But closer to home, we have a huge crisis unfolding in real time in North City, also to some extent in the Central West End. This terrible tornado that happened. Do you think the Statehouse can come together and do something to help St. Louis with that issue? Or should we not even hope that that could happen at this point?
No, I do. I do think so. The one thing, that I think we as just human beings, it's proven many times in history when real tragedy hits. And you just have to see it, and don't go up there if you don't have any reason. I've been up there twice, Saturday and Monday, and I've seen it firsthand. Um, if you can help, please help in any way, every way possible. But I do think we will come together for this. And I do think it's already happened. So the tornado hit, on Friday past, and the governor with the emergency response team from the state was already on the city's command center, which is at Kings Highway in Delmar. Saturday morning, I was there at 9:30, and it was clear to me they had already been there all night long. So the response was robust and continues to be. And I think there will be storm fatigue, right? There will be devastation fatigue, but we've got to ward against that. Everybody needs to take a break and get enough sleep. If I could give a shout out to Mayor Spencer, I'd say that has to happen, right? Or you can't continue to function, in crisis mode for more than, pick it, many days, up to a week maybe. But the coordinated effort that has to happen, federal, state, local, churches, not-for-profits, businesses, the construction community of St. Louis, it is all the above. And I can tell you firsthand, so my day job, is insurance, and I've been doing a lot of claims. And when the storm first hit, I live in the Holly Hills area right by Carnolet Park, I thought it was really bad. We've got those big trees. One was down on my immediate neighbor's house, and I thought, wow, this is bad. And then the next morning, I got up to the Central Corridor, Central West End. I walked in from Union and Delmar to Kings Highway and Delmar, and then a little north and east of there. And really, the pictures show the story, but when you see it firsthand, and, there was just grief and shock on people's faces. But by 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning, you saw neighbors out literally picking up bricks, taking branches off of cars, doing what they could do, which is what we have to continue. But this coordinated effort, so FEMA, and I'm doubtful. I'm going to be, cautiously pessimistic. I don't know what to say. I'm an optimistic guy, but I don't have much faith in it right now. But doggone it, if there's ever been a time when a city in its primarily most distressed parts needs immediate help, and it's not like this can wait very long. It really can't. Thank goodness we've got this, beautiful weather like this. But, if it would be 92 degrees, and I just think, temperatures rise as temperatures rise, and the level of stress adds on to people's lives. So
it's a tough situation for sure, but it sounds like you feel like despite the utter dysfunction that you've described, that the state is going to come through for St. Louis. Governor Kehoe, this is his first session that he's been a part of, taking over for Governor Mike Parson. Do you feel like he has St. Louis's best interests at heart? What's your sense of him at this point?
I do. So I'm not a friend with Governor Kehoe, but I've known him professionally now for several years, actually. And I think many of your listeners might know his life story, but it is unique. I'd say we're never, in the modern era, we're never going to have another governor who is born and raised the youngest of 6 kids to a single mother whose, dad was gone, poor, from North St. Louis. This is just never going to happen. Becomes this very successful Ford dealership businessman in Central Missouri because Dave Sinclair gave him his first job washing cars at, 13 or 14 years old. I mean, it's just, it truly is a Cinderella story. Like a lot of successful business people that have been super successful, and he is in that category. this is one that I believe he has not forgotten from whence he has come. And we're just not going to have, we have a unique situation that someone that truly knows St. Louis City and knows the North Side really well and can walk around and say, this was where I grew up. This was where I went to school. I remember taking the bus for, I don't know how many hours the guy took the bus to get to Chaminade.
Yeah.
Just things like that. So
this is a neighborhood that has deep emotional meaning for him. You don't think he's going to abandon it?
I do not. I really do not. I think the content of his character, not always his politics, but the content of his character is going to shine forth. And it takes also leaders like this, people in positions of power that do have an overly weighted influence, both at the state and federal level. And he is one of these people.
So I want to ask you one last question or one last line of inquiry as we're talking today. And, I know a lot of more progressive Democrats in the city who would consider somebody like you a moderate Democrat, if not more of a conservative Democrat. And they would say, why meet the Republicans 90-10, as you described? Why even try to work with these guys when they've shown their character, when they've shown that they just want to gut what the voters are going to do anyway, that they don't want the Democratic input? Do you think that was a waste of time to try to work with them to get things done?
I don't. And I think the reason is, and it can't be overstated, that the Democrats were trying to avoid this nuclear option to keep the Senate as a functioning body. These two things were going to happen. But if the more appropriate wording would have been there for the Amendment 3.
This one that's going back to the ballot.
And then if, I'll just say, changes to Prop A that kind of did need to be done. There were some little tweaks around the edges, and they wanted to debate, like, did you really mean it for like high school, the earned sick leave, for example, high school or college kids who work a seasonal job at Six Flags or, an ice cream place like Ted Drew's? Was it intended for that? And was there some wiggle room to clarify that? There was, but all of that was rejected out of hand. So I'm not saying that the Democrats, that we were going to say we were going to move 90% towards them, but we only have the ability to be obstructionists. And I think I know we on the House side, and I'm sure the Senate is true. We've talked about this in caucus a lot, and that we want to show to Missouri citizens, it's the Democrats in the state that are the adults in the room. We're the ones that say, yeah, we're going to fight about policy. We're going to bend as far as we can bend, but we're going to get good things done for people in this state. And we are not willing to be obstructionists when you would only be obstructing policies and benefits and issues that would affect the day-to-day lives of most Missourians, most especially working Missourians, at-need Missourians. And I think, and I'm kind of proud to stand with that. There's a time, to throw bombs. That to me is not most of the time, especially when you don't have the votes. When you're in a super minority position, you know what you could do? Stand up and be the adult in the room.
You guys were doing that.
We were doing that, and I'm proud of it.
And now you feel like you're not going to do that for the immediate future.
Yeah, no. It's not going to happen for the immediate future. And that's why when you said earlier about the special session, whether it's bringing back this one infrastructure bill on the budget that didn't pass, which would have benefited projects throughout the state, from the smallest of towns to the largest of cities, or the Chiefs and the Royals, I am very pessimistic that you'll see any movement on those things. Maybe if the negotiations go well enough, we can swallow our pride and get something done for Missourians. But without that, I don't believe things are going to be moving, and it is going to hurt people. This is not going to go on for a decade. Stephen Weber, a senator from Columbia, said, we're not talking a decade, but a couple of years of dysfunction, like the previous two, show you how bad a session can go.
And we're going to see that.
We are going to see that, I'm afraid to say.
State Representative Steve Butz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. It was my pleasure.
That was State Representative Steve Butz. He has served in the Missouri legislature since 2018. And in just a moment, Ryan Kroll joins us to talk about everyone's least favorite St. Louis street. That's for the closer. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of the 314 podcast is supported by Kranzberg Arts Foundation's Mati. Mati is back September 12th through the 14th. 3 days, 15 stages, and over 100 unforgettable performances. Catch legends like Common and Pete Rock, Patti LaBelle and De La Soul. Groove with R&B stars Lucky Day and Leon Thomas. Feel the soul of jazz with Branford Marsalis and Pedrito Martinez. And bring the funk with John Medeski and the SOS Band. Enjoy live music, art exhibits, food trucks, vendors, and good vibes, all in the streets of the Grand Center Art District. Grab your passes now at matistl.org. And now for the closer. St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Kroll has been covering the aftermath of the tornado that swept through St. Louis on May 16th. But he's also taken the time to report on a much different effort. This involves one of the most important streets in town, my personal least favorite to drive, and that is Gravois Avenue. Ryan Kroll, welcome.
Hey, good to be here. Happy to talk about Gravois, or as some non-native St. Louisans may call it, Gravois.
Gravois, I remember pronouncing it that way when I first moved here. I feel like this is just the worst street. I will actually avoid my GPS in order to avoid driving on Gravois. You think I'm alone in that?
No, I guess I'll give you my theory as to why it's so bad, then I'm curious to hear yours. It is sort of at an awkward angle. You know, a lot of the big streets in St. Louis either kind of run more or less north-south or east-west. But this one's at sort of strange curve or side angle. And what that does is all the intersections, or a lot of them, are at these kind of goofy non-90-degree angles, which makes it, I think, confusing for drivers to navigate. And then if you have confused drivers, that could just spell disaster for cyclists and pedestrians, people on foot. So that's my theory as to why it's so bad. What about you?
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that. I think it's also kind of the classic example of what people who pay attention to safe streets call a strode, a combination of a street and a road, and that you're kind of like moving fast on it. And at the same time, there's a lot of different places where you can turn off. And so it makes for this stop and go traffic. Drivers are like wildly distracted, and it tends to have really bad consequences for pedestrians and cyclists. And that's what you're focused on here.
Yeah, that's why sort of people in the cycling community are focused on it, I guess, more specifically. Yeah, they're kind of making they're really trying to draw attention to it. And that's because in April and May, back to back, there was 2 deaths on the street, really close in proximity to each other too. In Tower Grove South, there was a pedestrian struck and killed. And then just 1 block away, there was a cyclist who was struck and killed. So St. Louis has kind of made a lot of good progress on a lot of roads in terms of making them safer for people who aren't in cars. And folks who really kind of watch that space think that, you know, Gravois should be the sort of next street to kind of really get safety measures and some traffic calming measures put in.
Yeah, so traffic calming measures, what specifically are we talking about that they really want on Gravois?
Yeah, well, one guy in particular raised this interesting point where he said for like several months on Gravois, there was construction work kind of going down the center of it. So it was the 4-lane road was temporarily just a 2-lane road with this sort of like de facto median in the middle where the workers were. And he said it was a lot safer. It was a lot slower. People were sort of driving more mindfully. So I do think they want to see some medians put in places where the 4-lane street becomes a 2-lane street. And also bump outs, which are basically just these sort of like, little bits of infrastructure at the intersection where the person who's crossing the street is protected for a little bit on either side. So like the portion of the street you're actually walking across is shorter. And that also sort of forces drivers to kind of, slow down or sort of, be kind of more aware of the surroundings at those intersections. So those are 2 of them. Then there's more basic stuff like fresh paint, brighter paint, that kind of stuff.
So this all sounds great. It's very much in line with best practices in terms of making streets safer for pedestrians and for cyclists. And yet, as you reported on a story at stlmag.com, this one is unusually complicated. Tell us about the MoDOT factor.
Yeah, so Gravois, it is also a state route. I think it's State Route 30, which obviously no one calls it that. But that means that the Missouri Department of Transportation is responsible for maintaining it. And basically, so the city will be very adamant and say, this is our road. We can do whatever we want with it. But MoDOT it's their sort of responsibility in a lot of ways. So the same way that the city has kind of tackled Kings Highway and Natural Bridge, the city, in theory, could do that on Gravois, but because it is a state route, MoDOT has plans to sort of redo the whole street, which on the one hand is a good thing for city residents, but the bad thing is none of that's going to happen for about 5 years from now. I think it's 2030 when the work would actually be finished, and it's not going to start until 2029. So on the one hand, MoDOT likes to kind of do things very, scheduled in advance in these kind of 5-year sort of blocks, which makes it easy to kind of know what's coming down the pike, but it's not moving fast enough for a lot of folks who really care about this stuff and really care about making Gravois safer for cyclists and pedestrians in particular.
So you mentioned this idea that the city says we can do what we want here. I guess the rub is that then the city would have to pay for it.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. That's a great point. So basically, the city's kind of not really incentivized to do the work. They have limited money because MoDOT's going to pay for it down the line. So basically, if the city were to spend a lot of money on Gravois like tomorrow, they'd be doing a lot of the same stuff that MoDOT's already going to do. They'd just be doing it sort of on an expedited timeline. And they'd be likely to say, well, hey, we've got a lot of streets that aren't state routes. Why don't we spend our limited resources making those safer?
And yet at the same time, you kind of have this pressure where you have cyclists saying, like, people are dying now. So is there any way the city can kind of force MoDOT's hand on this? What does Mayor Kara Spencer say about this?
So she says that Gravois is very personally important to her. She made a big point saying that her son crosses it every day, either on bike or on foot. But I don't know. I talked to her and Scott Ogilvie, who's he's a high up in the streets department. I think of him as kind of like the street czar. They indicated that they were working with MoDOT, that the relationship with MoDOT's better than it's ever been. MoDOT's kind of more sort of in line with, making streets better for not just cars, but also for cars, cyclists, and pedestrians. So there was kind of a convergence of interests there or priorities. But the one thing that they haven't talked about is actually speeding up the MoDOT timeline. And I honestly don't think they're going to have any success doing that, just because, MoDOT's going to do what it's going to do. And they've kind of always done things on this 5-year timeline. I don't think they're going to switch that up just for one route here in St. Louis.
So then the pressure would be on the city to spend its own funds on this. And it was one thing when you went out reporting this story. I think it's sort of an important piece of timeline to mention here is you were out talking to Mayor Spencer, talking to Scott Ogilvie. This was all happening the morning of May 16th. The afternoon of May 16th is when this tornado came in. A whole bunch of things changed. People are still interested in getting this street fixed, but do you think it changes things significantly that suddenly we're looking at very urgent needs on the north side of town right now?
Yeah, I think it must. I mean, right, there's only sort of so much money to go around. Obviously, the north side's going to need a big chunk of that, whether it's, it's the Rams money. Like a big part of one of the big proposals that was sort of always in the mix with the Rams money last year was infrastructure. This would certainly fall under that, but it's hard to know how much of that is going to be sort of going to this sort of more urgent need, right, on the north side. And also, there's just this kind of idea that like, politicians always said that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. They can do multiple things. I believe that they can walk and chew gum, but I don't know that they could sort of walk and chew gum, pick up the trash, manage the potholes, fix the geysers that just sort of pop up in town every now and then, that kind of thing, and worry about Gravois. I fear that as urgent as Gravois is for some people, it seems like it's kind of one of those things that can easily get lost in the shuffle, particularly whenever you have some kind of natural disaster going on. I guess I would just say really quickly too, the one other angle here is that the new Mayor Kara Spencer, is an avid cyclist herself. She joined folks on this ride, the morning of that May 16th. So I don't think anyone doubts her sort of like that she cares about this, like legitimately, very much so. I think it's just a matter of, is it going to get sort of overtaken by current events?
Well, St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Kroll, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Fensky, and that's the 314 for today. You can find out more in our podcast show notes and at stlmag.com. You can also find me every day in your inbox thanks to St. Louis Magazine's fantastic free newsletter, St. Louis Daily. It's a fresh take on St. Louis with insight and original reporting, much of it by Ryan Kroll, who we just talked to. Sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. The 314 is a production of St. Louis Magazine. I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is the 314. See you next time.